What kind of aircraft shatters the sound barrier at a time when even the best fighters were shaking themselves apart in dives? In 1947, a bright orange rocket plane, the Bell X-1, dropped from the belly of a bomber and did the impossible. It outran its own thunder. Today, you'll see exactly how engineers turned a bullet with wings into the first manned supersonic flight, and why that single moment didn't just make history, it quietly lit the fuse on a new kind of power race. Stay with me, because the part almost no one tells is what nearly stopped the X-1 from ever flying, and how a last-second gamble changed everything. By the final years of World War II, fighter aircraft had pushed the limits of what propellers and jet engines could handle. Pilots regularly dived at speeds close to the mysterious sound barrier. But what they found wasn't just faster flight. It was chaos. At high subsonic speeds, shockwaves began to form around the aircraft. Control surfaces that normally responded instantly suddenly locked up. Entire planes shook violently. Many pilots described it as if the air itself had turned solid. The most terrifying effect was something called Mach tuck, when shockwaves over the tailplane forced the nose of the aircraft down into a steep, uncontrollable dive. For too many test pilots, those dives ended in tragedy. Planes disintegrated in mid-air, or simply never pulled out. The aviation world knew it had reached a wall. The so-called sound barrier wasn't just a figure of speech. It was killing machines, and the men flying them. The US and Britain were desperate for answers. But as they struggled, an even darker discovery raised the stakes higher than anyone expected. In 1943, Allied intelligence uncovered something that sent shockwaves through military circles. Hidden in German research files were design studies for a supersonic jet aircraft. It wasn't just theory. These were serious plans that suggested Germany was already envisioning aircraft capable of smashing through the sound barrier, while the Allies were still struggling with high-speed stalls. For Britain and the United States, the message was clear. They were dangerously behind. If the war had dragged on longer, those blueprints could have evolved into real weapons, changing the balance of air power. Suddenly, the sound barrier was no longer just an engineering challenge. It became a national security emergency. Both nations scrambled to launch projects aimed at conquering supersonic flight. Britain poured resources into the Miles M52, while the United States began laying the foundation for a top-secret rocket plane that would change history. But there was one problem. How do you build a plane to break a barrier that no one even knew could be broken? The answer would come in the form of a radical gamble. Faced with the German threat and mounting pilot losses, the United States decided it couldn't wait any longer. In 1944, American engineers launched two bold experimental projects. The first was the Douglas D-5558 Skystreak, a sleek turbojet design. The second was far riskier, a rocket-powered aircraft built by Bell Aircraft, what would eventually be known as the X-1. The choice to use rockets was daring, almost reckless. Jets offered more reliability, but rockets delivered the raw thrust needed to punch through the wall of compressibility. In other words, only a rocket plane had a real chance at Mach 1. Key figures like Theodore von Karman and Ezra Kocher backed the project. They argued that if America wanted to lead in the post-war skies, it needed to skip evolution and leap into revolution. The military agreed, but secrecy surrounded the program. Few outside a select circle of engineers even knew what was being attempted. On paper, the plan looked insane. Strap a man into a rocket, launch him into the unknown, and hope the laws of physics wouldn't tear both apart. And yet, inside Bell Aircraft's hangars, something extraordinary was taking shape. A bright orange machine that looked less like a plane and more like a giant bullet. But designing it was one thing. Getting it to actually survive supersonic flight would test the limits of engineering and the courage of the man chosen to fly it. Bell Aircraft's engineers knew that if their rocket plane was going to survive supersonic flight, it had to be shaped for the job. Their answer? Model the fuselage on something already proven to cut through the air at incredible speeds. A .50 caliber bullet. The result was a sleek orange rocket plane nicknamed the Bullet with Wings. The design was radical for its time. It featured razor-thin wings for stability, a pressurized cockpit so the pilot could breathe at extreme altitudes, and control surfaces reinforced to withstand forces no human had ever endured. Inside, engineers installed 4 rocket chambers, each of which could be fired independently, to control the thrust and pace of the flight. By March 1945, Bell had signed a contract to build 3 prototypes, designated XS-1, X for experimental, S for supersonic. But even with the bullet shape and rocket engines, the project faced serious problems. At supersonic speeds, aerodynamic data was almost non-existent. Every decision felt like guesswork. And then came the biggest risk of all, the cockpit itself. The pilot would sit just a few feet behind a volatile tank of liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel. One wrong move, one tiny leak, and the whole aircraft could erupt into a fireball. Still, the X-1 was built. It sat on the tarmac, gleaming orange, waiting. All it needed now was someone willing to climb inside and risk his life to make history. The man chosen to tame the X-1 was Captain Charles "Chuck" Yeager, a decorated World War II ace who had already proven he could keep his cool under fire. Yeager wasn't the most senior or the most famous pilot, but he had a reputation for calm nerves, sharp instincts, and a willingness to push machines further than anyone else dared. But just days before the historic flight, disaster nearly struck. While riding a horse, Yeager was thrown and cracked 2 ribs. He didn't tell his superiors. If the injury had been reported, he would have been grounded. Instead, he kept it quiet, strapping his side and enduring the pain. To even close the heavy cockpit hatch, he used a broom handle as leverage. The secrecy didn't stop there. The entire X-1 program was classified, hidden from the public and the Soviets alike. Few outside the Desert Air Base at Muroc, later Edwards Air Force Base, had any idea that the US was about to gamble on supersonic flight. For Yeager, the mission wasn't just about breaking records. It was about proving that the sound barrier was no barrier at all. If he succeeded, aviation would enter a new age. If he failed, the X-1 could easily become his coffin. And so, on an October morning in 1947, with his ribs still aching and the world watching in silence, Yeager prepared to climb into the bright orange bullet that could change history forever. October 14th, 1947. The desert air over Muroc was still, the kind of silence that feels like history waiting to be written. The Bell X-1, painted a blazing orange, was tucked beneath the belly of a modified B-29 bomber. Inside the cramped cockpit, Chuck Yeager strapped himself in, his ribs aching with every breath. At 23,000 feet, the B-29 released its cargo. For a heartbeat, the X-1 dropped like a stone. Then Yeager ignited the rocket engines. The aircraft roared forward, climbing through the sky with a force that pinned him against the seat. As the needle climbed, the controls stiffened. Shockwaves formed across the wings, buffeting the plane. This was the edge where countless test pilots had lost their lives. The sound barrier loomed just ahead, a wall of physics no one knew for sure could be broken. At Mach 096, the X-1 rattled violently. At Mach 098, the stick felt like it was locked in concrete. And then, suddenly, silence. The vibration stopped. The air smoothed out. The gauges read Mach 1.06. Yeager had done it. On the ground, observers heard the sky crack open with a sonic boom, a thunderclap that marked humanity's first supersonic flight. Yeager stayed calm, leveling out and gliding the X-1 back to the dry lakebed runway. For the first time in history, a man had outrun sound itself. The barrier that killed so many pilots wasn't a wall. It was a door, and Yeager had just kicked it wide open. The moment Yeager touched down, aviation entered a new era. What had been dismissed as a sound barrier was now proven to be nothing more than a psychological wall, one that technology and courage had finally broken through. Video transcript news of the flight was kept secret at first, released only months later. But when it finally reached the public, It sent shockwaves through the defense world. America had not only broken the barrier, it had claimed the high ground in the race for supersonic dominance. For Britain, the story was different. Their Miles M52 program, which could have rivaled the X-1, had been abruptly cancelled by politics. That decision left the US as the sole leader in supersonic research, a position it would hold for decades. The Bell X-1's success also lit the fuse for a new generation of experimental aircraft, the X-planes. These projects would pave the way for supersonic fighters, high-altitude spy planes, and even the spacecraft that would one day leave Earth's atmosphere. But beyond the machines, the message was clear. Whoever mastered supersonic flight would hold not just the skies, but the future of global power. And in the early years of the Cold War, that power was everything. Today, the Bell X-1 hangs in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, suspended as if still flying through the sky it once conquered. To most visitors, it looks small, just a slim, orange bullet with stubby wings. But its impact was enormous. The X-1 opened the path to legendary aircraft that followed: the F-100 Super Sabre, the Blackbird SR-71, and even the Space Shuttle. Every supersonic jet, every rocket plane, every craft that pierced the upper atmosphere owes part of its existence to that single flight in 1947. Chuck Yeager became an icon, the man who turned the impossible into reality. Yet the true legacy of the X-1 isn't just about one pilot or one machine. It's about what it represented. The moment humanity proved that limits are meant to be broken. The Cold War would fuel even greater leaps, from stealth bombers to reusable spacecraft. But none of it would have been possible without the day a bright orange rocket plane tore through the air faster than sound itself. And as the sonic boom echoed across the desert, the world changed forever. Because the X-1 didn't just break the sound barrier, it shattered the ceiling of human imagination.